Good morning, everybody. Hey, it's Stacy. There. This is walking in my shoes, and we are loving my veteran this morning. I'll be playing my hair all day, so I'm just going to ignore my hair. Sorry I'm a little late. Still drinking coffee, though. That's always helpful. Give everybody a second, because I am late, as usual. Late for my late start. We just had to go by and feed the kitty. Because the granddaughter's on her way home, and we wanted to make sure they had cat food and that all that good stuff was done. All right, so let me get back on the main road. Good morning, Pamela. All right, here we go. So today we're going to talk about terrorism. Terrorism is nothing more than a form of fear, and I think we live with it in our own lives so often. We create a lot of our own fear sometimes, and with 9/11 approaching tomorrow, it is important that we remember that all terrorism is fear. It creates that sense of terror. So that's what we want to talk about today. And, you know, we hear stories from spouses and from veterans, you know, night terrors that they have, which are basically dreams that they have at night that make them relive their fears and their situations. And that's basically what it is. It is a dream, a terror of something very fearful that has happened in their lives. So we have those. We also live in fear and in terror. Sometimes it is in our own home. Sometimes we are afraid to set our veteran off, so we walk on eggshells, and that fear becomes so overwhelming that we're going to set them off, that now we live in a sense of terror. And we live in this really heightened sense of anxiety, because terrorism causes an upswing in anxiety. So when you have fear and you're afraid that, hey, and what I'm going to do today, is it going to set somebody off? And you feel controlled by that fear. We all have moments that we feel controlled by our fear. And so when we do that, it becomes paralyzing at times.
It's Porky Pig.
And will you stop?
Sorry, it's Porky Pig.
We're following a truck. So when we get this fear over and over again, this fear becomes terrorism. And it controls our lives. So anxiety, things that we have going on in our lives that we are afraid of, it paralyzes us to the state that we become living in a state of terror. How do you overcome that? There's some things that are harder to overcome than others. You don't just forget. Good morning, Ricky. You don't just forget things that happened in your past that create anxiety. You don't just forget things that you are afraid of, okay? You don't just forget those type of issues. If you've made a mistake in your relationship and you see the pattern repeating itself, or you've had a hard time with it in the past, that somebody has done something, you've made changes in your life, and this is my Sarah Holbrook speech, Sarah, since you're watching for the day. You've made changes in your attitude and in your life, but you're still fearful of them going back to the same situation and having the same outcome. You get paralyzed, good morning, Erica, in a sense of terror. That becomes terrorism at its simplest form. So when we don't get out of our own heads or get out of our own way, we are creating terrorism in our own lives. Fear and anxiety.
No, I'm not going to follow.
Okay, sorry, y'all. This thing just broke out for a minute. So I hope I can get everybody back.
Porky Pig is getting passed.
Anyway, so we create this sense of fear. This sense of fear is something that we have in our own minds. And we have to learn to let this fear go. We have to learn to let this terrorism of our own lives go, because so often we create it in our own minds. And it's something that becomes paralyzing. People have fears. There's a lot of people who have fears of leaving their own home because something has happened to them at some point and they're afraid to leave their own home anymore. They literally live in a sense of terror. That's what happens. And you've got to learn to deal with and face your own fears. You have to face that moment of your own fears. So how do you do that? You have to look at things head on. You have to look for the root cause. You have to realize that you survived that moment, that it is okay. I can remember people talking about really bad car wrecks and as a paramedic, and they're like, oh my God, I'm like, but did somebody die? No. Then you're okay. That car can be fixed. But they create this sense of terror and panic, and you have to learn to talk yourself down, because when you have idle time in your head, morning Sarah Kim, when you have idle time in your head and that goes on and on and on in your lives, you create a bigger fear of what's going on and more anxiety. So you're afraid to trigger them. You're afraid that you're walking on eggshells because you don't want to trigger them. Good morning, Nikia. You don't want to trigger them. You're afraid that, oh my gosh, if I do this, it's going to be wrong. If I say this, it's going to be wrong. And so what happens? Over and over and over again, you keep creating this anxiety in your own body, in your own mind, in your own head, that now you are living in a true state of terror. And people are like, well, I just don't understand things. My veteran can be abusive, and it's mental abuse. Yeah, that constant state of fear is exactly that, as long as it's that fear in your own mind. But when you learn to set those boundaries, and when you learn that you can walk away from things, and you learn that, hey, it's okay for me to take that step and walk away and walk out of the situation, then you're no longer living in that Oh, well, it let me back finally. So now we're not even sure who's still on and who's not. Sorry. I guess maybe Facebook doesn't like the title I gave this. So let me try to go forward with where we were with anxiety and fear and terror. I think back a lot of times to World War II. And this is really a sad part in U.S. history that people don't think about. But when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, people in this country were so afraid of Japanese people. And so they went in and they took people that looked Japanese, whether they were Chinese or Japanese or Vietnamese, that were Asian, and some of the Hawaiians, and they put them literally in camps in our own country. Okay, because we were afraid of that. We were afraid of people who looked that way. So we created another form of terrorism. We were afraid of that. I go back and I think about even 9/11. And so in 9/11, and this is probably one of the hardest things for me, y'all know it's one of my own personal triggers, but to talk about is when they did the memorial, okay? When they built the memorial at 9/11, and in the basement of the old World Trade Centers, there is a chapel. And there are chapels. And so there's one for, Christians, and there's one for the Jewish people. And so what happened was they did not want to build one for Muslims to use. And I'm thinking, but how many Muslims were in the World Trade Center that weren't terrorists at all? But we became afraid of them. We as a country decided that people who looked a certain way were out to get us, and it was harmful. And so we created this sense of fear in amongst ourselves. We do it everywhere. Go back into the 80s, in the early 80s, when HIV was prevalent, And it was, oh, you're only going to get HIV from somebody who's gay. And so that became terrorism. We were afraid, and people who were gay were actually beaten and killed and everything else, because they were like, well, if we get rid of you, we'll get rid of the disease. And that, again, was not true. So it's this fear that we create in our own mind. I know, our lumber shortage. It is the fear that we create in our own minds and what we are given from the outside. And stuff that we are given from this outside over and over again, this outside stimulus that comes into us that creates this fear, that creates terrorism because it creates anxiety. And you have to overcome it by looking at it correctly and analyzing it correctly. And how you do that is getting out of your own head. We get in our own way so often. We have to take care of our own heads. We have to understand that what we've been through in the past, what we've been led to believe at times, the outside stimulus, all the things that are coming into our world, we can't internalize them and create anxiety. We have to let that go. We have to make that move forward to let it go, because all it is creating terror. There are people who still cannot get on an airplane today because of 9/11. They will not get on an airplane. When the reality was there were thousands of flights in the air when those four planes. When the 4 planes hit the towers. The 2 hit the towers and the Pentagon and the field. But there were only 4 planes of the thousands and thousands of planes that were in the air. But everybody created this fear of getting on that plane. And so you have to let that go and rationalize for yourself, hey, this isn't real. Or this is real, but this is not harmful to me. And so again, we talk about the way we talk with our veterans, the walking on the eggshells, the anxiety that it creates, the moments that we don't want to trigger them, the things that we don't want to do. Let me tell you, I was in a much worse place in my relationship. Carl and I were in a much worse place coming from me, because I was so afraid of setting him off that I was afraid to live. And that is terrorism in its purest form. He didn't create it. I created it in my own head. And we do this all the time. That's what people who are terrorists, that's what they thrive on. They thrive on being able to create this fear and anxiety that is so paralyzing that you can't function and you can't go forward. And that's what they thrive on. And that's how terrorism breeds. So how do you stop it? Is by getting out of your own head. By realizing that not everybody is against you. That realizing not everything you do creates a situation. By learning to accept the fact that you're good enough and all of these demons that come into your head can't stay there. All of these fears, all of these anxieties, they can't stay there. You know, David's getting ready to they're on their way home with the baby. Makes me super excited. But when David was very little, baby size, he stopped breathing 26 times in one night. Well, I had a friend who was a friend of the family that they had a son who he also stopped breathing and had the apnea over and over and over again, was hospitalized many times. And because I had been around Joey when it happened with David, I wasn't all freaked out. It wasn't this terroristic moment. But when Seth came, and then of course David went on a monitor. When Seth came along, I wanted Seth on a monitor instantly. And the doctors were like, no, we're going to do a test and we're going to find this. But I had my own fear that my child was going to die because I let it stay in my head. And so it paralyzed me as a mother. Seth didn't sleep at night. He had his days and his nights backwards. And I guess maybe in a way I created that because when he was newborn and first came home, I didn't let him sleep. Like every light in the room was on. Every time he'd go to sleep, I'd shake him. You know, like shake his back, not shaking baby syndrome, but I'd shake his back and be like, oh my God, is he breathing? Well, yes, he was breathing. But I created this fear of my own with him. And so I was afraid. I was afraid of that whole situation. And it paralyzed me as a new mom to the second child. It was paralyzing to me. So I had to start really rationalizing, look, Stacey, he has had the test, he's breathing, he's fine. And then I begged for him to sleep through the night, but I had woke him up for 4 weeks going into that. So no, he wasn't going to sleep through the night. So I paid for it dearly for a year and a half. But that's what we go through when fear becomes crippling to us. So all I'm saying is to all of us is we need to learn to let go of that. How do you've got to find your inner peace. Your inner peace controls you. Your own head, Carl is always telling me, get out of your head. Get out of your head, get out of your own way. Get out of your head, get out of your own way. And when I'm not doing that, when I'm not actively getting out of my head or getting out of my own way, I am not productive. We argue a lot when I do that.
You turn into a brat.
I turn into a brat. No, I turn into a bitch. Let's just go flat out.
And that's why when people ask me, how long have you been married? I say 14 years, because my wife's a bitch, and I can count them in dog years.
Really?
No, I'm making that up.
He's not even being nice. But that's what happens. You have to get up. And our veterans also have to learn. And there are coping skills that teach them and their tools that go in their toolbox how to get out of their own way. And especially, you know, when we have veterans who have lost somebody in combat with them. And
We're not gonna do this with me in the car, are we?
No, this is simple, babe. Just too simple.
Oh, it is. Sarcasm is generally the adjustable wrench that fixes everything with the
and their job is to protect. Why do you think they get so uptight about protecting us? See, it all goes back to the same basic core. It is all about how you deal with what's in your head. And that is so hard, is to learn to let that stuff go. Now we're running on the dirt road and we're all bouncy. Yeah. So as we're getting into tomorrow, I'll do some more later today, but as we're getting into tomorrow, y'all just be patient with each other. Learn not to let fear overtake your life. You will be all right. There is anxiety, but it will be okay. It's when your fear and anxiety overtake who you are, that's when terrorism strikes. And we, at our root, have that control. So I'm going to get off of here. Y'all have a blessed day. I'm Stacey. This has been Walking My Shoes. We are loving my veteran. Have a blessed day. Bye.